get started. Hello, everyone. And as more people come in, I'll won't be too late because I'll just have a few words right now to say something about the conference, the seminar here. My name is Joshua Fitzgerald, and I'm a Mesoamericanist, colonial Latin American ethnohistorian, the current Rubinoff Junior Research Fellow at Churchill College. I'm one of the co-conveners of this series, and on behalf of Oliver Antzek, who unfortunately cannot be with us today because he's actually crossed the Atlantic doing some research, and then also Elizabeth Desmarais here at Churchill as well, and the Cambridge Department of Archaeology and the McDonald Institute of Archaeological Research here. It gives me and us great pleasure to welcome you virtually to the first of 8 Garrod Research Seminar meetings. This meeting is being recorded for educational purposes, just to keep you aware of that. And we're in the meeting format, so you can feel free to have your video on or off throughout the proceedings, but please make sure to mute yourself at this time. Take a moment to mute yourself at this time. Thank you for connecting with us from around the globe. We have a lot of wonderful people joining us today, wonderful scholars that we're really excited to hear your feedback. At your convenience, please go ahead and take a look at the seminar term card that's been circulated thus far and register for some of the following speakers. It'd be great to have you continue the conversation with us, as well as follow the social media formats, Twitter and Instagram. You can find the University of Cambridge Archaeology feeds there, and the hashtag Garrod is another way to follow along. At this time, we remind you again to mute your microphones. And we'll encourage you to give us questions and comments and speak with Professor Singleton after her presentation during the Q&A session that will follow. Throughout the proceedings, through all these proceedings, as with all departmental functions here, we ask you to observe respectful exchange of ideas with our guests. Organizing this conference has been a pleasure, and so I would like to go ahead and thank everyone involved. There have been some white knuckle moments, but luckily the department and all technology has been able to help us get into this and have a wonderful seminar ahead. Oliver and I thank the staff and faculty for their constant support, especially Emma Jarman, Imogen Bradley, Laurie Bonner, Paul Lane, former Institute Director Cyprian Brubank, and our new Deputy Director Matthew Davis for all your help. Thank you so much. Before I introduce Theresa, I just want to make a comment here about the series and the themes of the series, how it connects with the famed archaeologist Dorothy Garrod, for whom it's named. It's about just shy of a century ago, in 1925, Garrod stood at one crossroads of the Eastern Atlantic Ocean, standing on the Rock of Gibraltar and staring down into the stone and sand that comprised her first professional dig, the excavation of Devil's Tower Cave. She would document the second Neanderthal skull found at the site, among other symbols of occupation, and she pondered past humans, their movements, and the material culture that informed their lives. She would show that Gibraltar had not been a prehistoric land bridge that connected the remains to the African continent, as some had proposed. Rather, humans of the day had crafted vessels to help them migrate. Their relationship with the waters before them could be both delimiting and connective for humans, facilitating connections with things behind them, things currently in their possession, and the more materials and places they were yet to fashion. I want to highlight that moment and the symbolic aspect of it, because I think it resonates with the North Atlantic Highway materiality and mobilities throughout Europe, Africa, and the Americas seminar we're launching today. This research seminar has continued the innovative practices of Garrod and other Cambridge archaeologists, offering weekly meetings and collaborative endeavors that we're happy to have you join. This is a time to discuss past mobilities when we are considering mobility and immobility in our own lives today, and also environmental concerns, the threats that we face, how we navigate water, and the concerns that we have today about water. And so I'll go ahead and hand off now to Liz Desmarais, who will introduce our speaker today, Theresa Singleton. Liz,
I'm here.
Thank you. Great. Wonderful.
It's such a pleasure to welcome Theresa Singleton. She has had a long journey here. She was supposed to be with us last year and has finally come over to Cambridge and came over in Michaelmas term. It's wonderful to have you, Theresa, have you here and speaking to us today. Theresa is professor in the Department of Anthropology at Syracuse University in New York State in the United States. And this year she's the Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions at the University of Cambridge. She's a native of Charleston, South Carolina, and she received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Florida. Her areas of expertise include African diasporas, slavery on plantations, museums, Southern United States and the Caribbean, particularly Cuba. So she's worked a lot in the state of Georgia in the United States and also in Cuba. And she has worked very extensively in Cuba and recently published in 2015, Slavery Behind the Wall, an archaeology of a Cuban coffee plantation. That was 2015. And she's currently here working on a book that's tentatively entitled The Archaeology of Plantation Lives in the Southern United States and the Caribbean. Theresa, it's wonderful to have you here. And without further ado, I want to welcome you and hand over. And we very much look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you for that great introduction. And I guess, should I share my screen already or, well, first I want to thank Josh and Oliver for inviting me to launch this series. I have to say I was somewhat reluctant to do it because this isn't really my area, or at least I didn't see where my research really fit in to well, looking at the mobilities and materialities across the Atlantic. I mean, I guess that most of my research has focused on primary diaspora, the primary African diaspora, which is the transatlantic slave trade. And while I've mentioned sort of secondary diasporas in some of my writings, I really haven't done much research on that. But I thought that this would be a good opportunity to look at what other people have done or are doing now. Actually, some of this research is really at the beginning stages of looking at both secondary diasporas of the African diaspora as well as reverse diasporas. I think now I want to share my screen. Do I just go ahead and do that? Oh.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. And then oh, what happened? Oh gosh, that's, oh, I see what I did. One of the reasons why I've been interested in secondary diasporas is that in many ways, I think that's will help us to better understand some of this presumed African, many of which interpretations have been controversial of African-derived cultural practices among diaspora communities. And it's very speculative on my part, but I think that some of these practices we're seeing were really introduced as a secondary migration as opposed to maybe a primary migration, particularly when you see these practices having been in place or occurred or still being practiced many generations after the transatlantic slave trade. And so that's been something I've just sort of mentioned in some of my writings. I was very surprised, however, when two cultural anthropologists who are working on a secondary diaspora of Cape Verdean immigrants in the United States, cited me as someone who had written about secondary diasporas. Well, actually, they listed, I guess, all the people who probably mentioned the term, because they had maybe 10 or 12 different authors. And I've since I became aware of their work, I now use their definition to talk about what's a secondary, or to sort of frame what a secondary diaspora is. And it should have at least these three main points, or some, or maybe not all three, but at least some aspect of this. And it's a secondary movement derived from the initial or primary diaspora. And again, because we're talking about the African diaspora, the primary diaspora, at least historically, would be the transatlantic slave trade. And then the secondary migration can happen or is distant in time and space, meaning it could be something that was maybe shortly after the first diaspora, which one of the examples I'm going to talk about is, or it could be, many generations later. And then this third point is that it could be either, it's often voluntary, unlike a primary diaspora, which is usually force or the conditions for the push to move or to migrate are so insurmountable that people really don't have a choice. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about secondary diasporas. And then reverse diaspora, this idea of sort of returning back to Africa. The term itself sort of comes from Namata Blyden, who talks about West Indians in West Africa. And she calls it the African diaspora in reverse. So I'm looking at two case studies that are secondary diasporas and two that are diasporas in reverse. And the first sorry, you lost my space. The first major diaspora or secondary diaspora, and one of the earliest, is in fact the African diaspora or the movement of Black Loyalists to Nova Scotia. And the Black Loyalists were the people who sided with the British during the American Revolution. And they actually were relocated in a number of places, in addition to Canada, England, the British West Indies, and then eventually, actually it's almost like a third diaspora. Many of the Black Nova Scotians actually ended up going to Sierra Leone. So this has been a diaspora that was investigated by archaeologists for quite some time. I guess they began in the, seems like it was the early or late, well, actually early 90s, and it continued until 2008. There were several settlements in Nova Scotia. The one in which received archaeological attention is located to the southeast of Birchtown. That's the main one. I think there might have been some other work at some of the others, but it was probably the largest settlement. It had as many as 3,500 Black Loyalists to settle there. Still, it's important too to recognize that maybe only just a small minority of the Black Loyalists that actually were able to relocate. Even though the British government or military had promised to free the Black Loyalists, because many of them were enslaved. When the British realized they were losing the war, they also realized they couldn't take all these various peoples with them. While we don't have an exact number, I remember a trip when I was in the Georgia coast on Tybee Island, a good colleague and friend told me you're at the spot where there were 30,000 Blacks Black Loyalists who were hoping for the British to take them, and only a small minority of that number. That 30,000 seems like a lot, but that's what some of the literature suggests, that it was that many, and the vast majority of them were unable to go and were recaptured into slavery. But in Nova Scotia, the Black Loyalists had hoped to, or had given various promises about land, having lots, and also having some sort of stability. But after they got there, they really encountered a lot of hardships. The main thing being the harsh climate. The soil was unsuitable for cultivation. There was high unemployment. And they did encounter some, violence and racist attacks from some of the whites already in Nova Scotia. So when the Sierra Leone company that was established in 1791, about half of these Black Loyalists decided that they would go there where they were of the opinion or thought they would have a greater opportunity to establish their own political, own polity, or certainly a community that they thought would be less hostile. But those that did stay, in time, things have improved, and today there is quite a large community. There are like 50 different. I saw a video when I was sort of compiling this and showing Black Loyalists today who are still very much proud of their heritage. And they actually have several different Black Loyalist heritage organizations in Nova Scotia today. As for the archaeology, much of it was involved in, or much of it, actually a lot of the artifact kind of analysis that I guess many of us are used to. I haven't been able to find much information on that. Some of the work was done by a student or someone who received their master's degree from one of the Canadian institutions. And I know I met with her years ago in Toronto at a conference, and I know there had been some funding problems which often accompanies archaeology. You can get the money to do the field work, but to get money to do the analysis and maybe some special analysis is always more difficult. And in this slide, one of the things that she was able to do using GIS was to sort of geo-reference the plots that the various individuals, heads of households, were given. One of the conflicts the Black Loyalists had in Nova Scotia with the Canadian government, or I guess at that time it was still a British colony, was that they didn't have enough lots for all the people who were claiming lots. And so that caused some conflict from the very beginning. But then there are those who did get lots. Some of them were able to do quite well. I mean, they got nice, they're able, because they were skilled or had something to offer, were able to sort of maintain a fairly comfortable lifestyle. And these are just a couple of recovered artifacts that are apparently, or they believe, recovered from the lot of a more or less a middle class Black loyalist and his wife. He had been, you see these regimental buttons, he had been in the military. He had an office in the Black militia. And his wife, who was a New Yorker and actually a free Black, her family were prominent. And so the pearl will wear bowl, which was popular at the time, but also sort of points to their sort of middle class background. Moving on to Freetown and Sierra Leone, what caught me about when I saw this particular print, in some ways I said, you know, this could really be Charleston or any place, because it looks so, you know, it looks so very English to me. But in Sierra Leone would be, again, an example of a reverse diaspora. The initial settlement of Sierra Leone, just to give some background, really started with a way to relieve the poor Blacks in London, and about 400 of them went to Sierra Leone and established a settlement that was named after one of the abolitionists, Granville Sharp, and it was called Granville Town. But the indigenous Africans razed the town and burned it in 1789. And so then the Sierra Leone company that was emerging brought in the 1,300 Black loyalists from Canada to come and settled. And they founded the town of Freetown, and and this is just a map to show where, this is just a map to show where the where Sierra Leone is and where Freetown is. This map on the right is really a site that one of our students at Syracuse is working on, probably as we speak, or at least writing it up as we speak. But the Nova Scotians, which is how they were called in Sierra Leone at the time, they were the ones that founded Freetown and built a lot from 300 to 400 houses by 1797, and they had moved there or settled there in 1792. So within 5 years, they did quite a bit of building. And this isn't one of the original houses, but this was the type of house that they did build. Some of the person who wrote this article in Architectural Review, for example, says that it resembles Southern houses or Southern United States. And while I've seen houses like that in the South, it actually reminds me more of Caribbean houses on some of the islands where you have a foundation, a masonry foundation that's 3 or 4 feet high, and then you build the superstructure out of wood. You see that a lot in various parts of the Caribbean, particularly areas where that are very hurricane prone. I mean, you do see this kind of house or historically in Charleston and well, actually more, I've seen this more in sort of, not so much Savannah proper, but on some of the islands, the concept, not the time period, but the concept of this type of instruction. But anyway, a whole nother topic is that these types of houses, even though they continued to be built by the descendants of the early settlers at Freetown, today there are like very few of these now because people prefer masonry houses. One of the things that happens at Freetown, and it's not just the Freetown, but it's the whole peninsula here that's Creole. They become and are today identified as one of the ethnic groups, and this includes all the waves, the first whoever survived from that first wave of Black Londoners, and then you had the Nova Scotians, and then you had Maroons when the Second Maroon War in Jamaica ended. 550 of them were exiled, and they were brought to Sierra Leone. However, by this time, the Black Nova Scotians, at least a faction of them, were getting disillusioned with the Sierra Leone company who controlled all the resources, and they rebelled. And the British Navy, and they also used the Maroons to help quell the rebellion. So that brought some internal conflicts there between two of these groups. But ultimately, but what happened because of that rebellion, the Sierra Leone company, they decided to not get any more settlers from the Americas, and instead the new settlements were of liberated Africans that the British Navy rescued from the slave trade once the slave trade was made illegal in Britain. And it was also around that time in 1807 that Sierra Leone becomes a crown colony for the British. But so all these various groups, including the resettled Africans, they all become what's known today as the Creole ethnic group. And so this is here you see on this Freetown Peninsula. What our students in our program in Syracuse, he's completing his dissertation on one of those resettlement communities. He's actually Nigerian, Oluse Abalusi. And this is the town that he's investigating, Regent. And this is a historical depiction of what Regent may have looked like in 1821. The settlement was founded in 1812. And he chose this township. There were about 10 or 12. He chose this one because it was one of the better known ones. It also seemed really well preserved. And then also when he was doing his pre-dissertation research, we always have our students to go in the field, usually after preferably after their first year, the summer of their first year, and then usually the second year, because fortunately we have money for that at this point for them to do that. And on his first trip, he was able to visit the village leaders and some of the prominent members who still actually are part of the Regent Township, and they were very encouraging. So that more than anything was the issue that persuaded him to focus on this this town of formerly liberated Africans from the slave trade. And he's actually found quite a bit of interesting materials. Again, the preservation was very good. What his dissertation is looking at, well, he's actually looking at a number of things, but one of the things is that he is actually looking at trade relations, which all these artifacts represent, except for the locally made ones, which were made by the indigenous Africans. So there was evidence of trade between the two. And then also looking at the household economies, the different kinds of ways in which they were producing, or different kinds of work activities and the kinds of things they were producing, and different kinds of ways of, for their livelihoods. And so what he's done is excavated two households, or two structures. I think they may be more than just like one single sort of household, but more, because these are huge houses, are huge lots from what I've been able to observe in his presentations. But he's done all his field work. He's the only person I know who's benefited from COVID. He passed all his exams, or all to become a doctoral PhD candidate. You have like a formal defense of your proposal. So he left for Sierra Leone in December 2019, before anyone knew about, or before news came out about COVID, and he's been there ever since. He couldn't come because of the lockdowns, he couldn't get back to the United States. He couldn't go back home to Nigeria, or was concerned about if he went back to Nigeria, he wouldn't be able to get back to Sierra Leone. So he stayed there, and he's been there 2 years, and he's done all his field work. It did hamper his ability to do some of the archival work because the local archives, they were locked down. I mean, they were closed, but now they've reopened. So he's writing, and actually I hear from him almost every week because he's also applying for jobs and postdocs because he anticipates defending the spring. So from there, I'm moving more quickly than I thought. So from there, I'm looking at my third case study, which is another secondary diaspora, this time from the United States, but specifically the northeastern United States to the Caribbean, to Haiti. Or Haiti when this is post, well, of course, if it's Haiti, it has to be post-Haitian Revolution, but this is also when Haiti controlled the entire island of Hispaniola, and which was for a period of about 21 years, from 1822 to 1840. And what you see in this slide are the various places within Hispaniola, which migrants from the United States went to in the Dominican Republic. Once Haiti became a independent nation, a new nation, one thing that they did was to advertise for either Black settlers to come to Haiti, and an agent went to the United States, and they promised to pay for the passage, give them land, and if they didn't like it, even the return passage to the United States. And this appealed to a lot of free Blacks, particularly in the Northeast, and Philadelphia, for example, was one of the places where some of the migrants came from, although other cities were involved. But the migration, like so many of these kinds of endeavors, didn't work out as well for either side, the Haitians or the African Americans. The migration project itself was sort of poorly managed. And then there was fraud with some of the sea captains. They were collecting money from the Haitian government, but really not bringing any people. And then a third of the people, it's estimated about a third of the people died, perished, either on the trip itself or shortly after they arrived, being exposed to tropical diseases. And then there was just a whole conflict between Americans, the Black Americans who were primarily Protestant English speakers, and the Haitians who were Catholic and French or Spanish speakers. And so within a year, the project failed. And then and then also 2,000 Black Americans went back. The only colony that did survive is this one on the northeastern, again, it's on a peninsula in Samana, which is in the Dominican Republic. And the according to this, only 200, other places say there are about 300 people that went to Samana, but that that community has survived until today. And there's just showing you where that is. Part of the reason why many believe it did survive is because of its location. It's sort of a rugged area geographically. And up until modern roads were built, the only way you could get there was by boat. So that meant that the people who settled there were in this were very isolated, and maintained their English language and many of their customs until the 20th century, when they became, pretty much victims of some of the 20th century dictators in the Dominican Republic. Here's a print showing Frederick Douglass in Samana, and I guess some of you are saying, well, why was he there? Well, he was there actually in the employ of, I guess, as a consultant for the US government, who was considering at the time annexing the Dominican Republic. And they were specifically interested in Samana because of building a military base there, particularly a naval base, where they could refuel. That didn't happen, and annexation plan didn't happen, but Douglas interviewed a lot of the people in the community. And Kristen Fellows, who did a project she's an archaeologist, but her project is primarily ethno-historical, as opposed to doing any major field work. And she relied heavily on Douglas's interviews to find out some of the historical issues that the community had. And then I also included this example because this is actually a place I visited in my various trips to Samana. And this was the Green family. And they invited me over, or invited me and a Dominican friend of mine who I was traveling with over for not Thanksgiving, New Year's dinner. And so I met Mr. Green earlier in Santo Domingo. And while he's a fluent English speaker, the rest of his family, for example, this older woman here, she knows a few phrases, or knows some English, but not very much. Most of the family now speaks Spanish, and of course, Spanish they were compelled to go to Spanish schools and learn Spanish in the 20th century. I mentioned that some of the dictators treated them like victims. They burned much of the historic town, the historic settlement that was founded in 1824, that was destroyed, parts of it was destroyed. And they just had a lot of they've, just, well, prejudice, ridicule for their being, American and English, and also the Haitian connection as well as worked against them as well, but they still survive as a community, but increasingly more and more of them have integrated into Dominican society. A number of anthropologists have written about them over the years. And they continued. I got this feeling, in some ways it reminded me of working with the Galagici, which some of the people just feel like they've just been overburdened with people coming to see this enclave of descendants from Americans living in the Dominican Republic. And because that wasn't I didn't go there to study them. I just, like I said, I was invited by one of the members of their family. But I think they, while they appreciate, I guess, the interest, on the other hand, it can be sort of burdensome. And then my final example is a back to Africa. I'm not even reading my notes. Example, and I'm not gonna say too much about this case because I suspect Alessandra Cummings, who's one of the speakers from Barbados, she probably knows a lot more about this particular case than I do, and will probably, I'm not sure what she's going to talk about, but I'm just thinking this might be part of something she can elaborate on in her talk. One of the reasons why I'm talking about it is, again, to talk about one of our former graduate students, Mike O'Reilly, who now is on the faculty at City University in New York. He and Carol Lee, and there's Matthew Riley. I think I said Michael Riley. Matthew Riley, that's him, I think, operating a I said a Zoom, but anyway. And Carol Lee Blanton, they're collaborating on a project to examine the settlement of Barbadians who resettled in Liberia in 1865. Most of us know about Americans going there, but and a lot of the historiography uses the term Americo-Liberians, but the emphasis or the focus is usually on the US component. And one of the things that Carrie in her book points out that that the Barbadians had sort of a distinct, well, first of all, they had their own settlement, a distinct settlement or distinct settlements. And their situation, their identity in Liberia was distinct from that of the US base group. And so what they're trying to do in this collaborative work is focus on a settlement known as Creswell. It's named after a Barbadian, I believe, whose name was Crocer. And I was trying to find a good map of it and wasn't able to, but it's essentially about 30 kilometers, 30 31 kilometers inland from Monrovia. And so that's what they're doing is Matt Riley, they've done, I think, 2 field seasons there so far. And they've, he and Carrie have co-authored an article that was published in the journal, Barbadian Journal, that I believe is published by the museum there. And what in that article, they talk about the material dimensions of this diaspora, or reverse back to Africa project. And one of the things that struck me was the fact that the Barbadians brought food crops there that were, some of them were probably already produced to some extent, like breadfruit, for example, but they brought their own variety that was grown in Barbados. And so that was one way in which they certainly influence foodways. They also produced sugar and introduced a drink called, well, it's alcoholic, it's called cane water, but it was something that people were able to produce in their houses. And one thing that Matt Riley found was the vats where they produce this particular drink inside the houses. Let's see what these. Unfortunately, the Barbadians were a target, an unfortunate target of the Liberian Civil War, which lasted from what long Civil War from 1989 to 2003. And so many of their houses were destroyed and property ruined. And Merrick Poznansky, about 30 years ago, he aptly predicted that, perhaps after the end of the Civil War, that, this would be a time when maybe archaeologists would be needed and could do projects like this Back to Africa project that would coincide with rebuilding the nation. And that's exactly what seems to be happening. So, again, they're at the early stages, but there's encouragement both in Liberia, as well as among the Liberians, as well as people in Barbados. And then this final slide was just to show what breadfruit eddos. In the article, they talk about eddos, and I had no idea what an eddo looked like. Actually, they remind me of what I believe in Cuba, I know they call them malongas, but anyway, and breadfruit is actually, I've seen it before, but I don't think I've actually ever eaten it. But anyway, I don't know whether some people might want to see that or not. I want to conclude by just talking about some of the commonalities and differences among these 4 case studies. And it wasn't until I started really writing this up that I realized that 3 of the case studies are geographically located on peninsulas, and how these peninsulas, serve to isolate these communities, and at the same time, help them to maintain their distinct identities. And the Black Loyalists and the people in Seminar, how they experience, alienation which is considered a traditional characteristic of a diaspora. The communities in Freetown probably did at various points experience alienation, but once they became, through this process of ethnogenesis, a new ethnic group, or considered a new ethnic group, they were, they ultimately became part of the upper classes of Sierra Leone, and part of the political and social elite. And to some extent, that's probably applies to the Barbadians in Liberia as well, maybe not quite as much, but to some extent. And in some ways, the Creoles are almost, the Creoles of Sierra Leone were almost like a settler society. So in that way, it's different. The Regent site is actually more of a primary diaspora, because the residents were, liberated from ships. They hadn't actually gotten to the Americas yet. So, so it was really a primary diaspora, but they also integrated, into with these earlier waves of people, so that you did have, so they became part of this new cultural identity, on Freetown Plaza. There are probably other parallels and other things that maybe people would be able to point out in the discussion. And I guess just my sort of final thing is that Afro-descendants, they did, they moved to these various, or took the opportunity because they really thought it was going to bring a better life. And in some cases it did. In some cases, whether they really achieved that, it's unclear. But, it just shows just how persistent they were in trying to find a place that would be better than what they had experienced previously. And so that's it. And thanks for listening.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. Everyone will agree with me that we can go ahead and thank Theresa, Professor Singleton, for her presentation. Very thought-provoking discussion, lots of material to discuss. And I was just, the idea resilience that you brought up at the end, I think is so powerful to think about. But also, I was just, that connection you made at the end about cartography, the geography that surrounds each of these communities, and how it could be both maybe something, a blockade that would keep them, could be insulating them from change, but also they could use it to their advantage to, but also be challenged by outsiders and be targets because of that insulation over time. I think was really important to bring in. And so we'll go ahead and open up the discussion to questions. We have a good amount of time for discussion, 30 minutes. If you would like to propose a question, you can use the raise hand feature down under the reactions key of the Zoom window. You're able to click on that and then click the raise hand button. It's a large button at the base there. Also, you can sort of, if your video's on, you can sort of wave about and move about and get my attention that way. Or you can also send a chat to myself. We've opened up the chat feature now, had it disabled during the talk just to allow for us to focus. But yeah, you can post materials to me directly and I can read them out for you, or Liz, and we can read them out for you, or yeah, we can answer them as they come along. Let's go ahead and see what we have for questions from the audience. Okay, great. Let me just see here. Carmen has a question here. Go ahead. Carmen, would you like to go ahead and turn, and you can feel free to turn on your video if you'd like.
Hello. Thank you so much, Professor Singleton, for that amazing discussion. It was very, very interesting. So my question was, if we want to get in contact with you after this talk, just to talk more about your research, how would we go about doing that?
Well, I actually have a Cambridge email, so it's just a matter of putting my Theresa Singleton, Theresa with an H, Singleton. So it should be difficult. If that's, no, I mean, I'm going to be, and I am going to be here until, I guess, July. So I'm not, so I'll be around. Are you in Cambridge or?
Yeah, so I'm actually from Rochester, New York, so pretty close to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I'm doing my MPhil here in Cambridge, and I'm also Cuban American. So I wanted to like just sit down and pick your brain about like your research that you've done in Cuba and stuff, because I would be so interested in that.
Oh,
So I'm
okay.
definitely gonna
Yeah,
get
no,
in
I mean,
contact with you.
I'm around. I mean, it's not, I mean, just email me. That's what I would say. And I'll be available, and particularly this term, because I have commitments 3 days a week, so I'll be in town.
Okay, then I'll definitely email you then. Thank you again, Professor Singleton.
Great, thank you for that. I mean, it's a really important question. I mean, what was so great about the talk was seeing how many scholars you have inspired, how you've, the career that your track record, how you've inspired work in the field. It's so great to actually see that generational aspect, the sort of community that you've built up and how you're bringing their research into your research. You know, it's a really great project, I think. And so we do have another question here. Let's see here. It's Mariana Pereira. Did you want to go ahead and answer your question, ask your question?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Professor Theresa, for coming and joining us and bringing in the topic of diasporas and the concept of secondary and reverse diasporas, which I've never heard before. So it's quite exciting. And I'm wondering, and I know diasporas are quite complex social constructions and expressions. And so I don't know if my question is problematic, but when we talk about the notion of secondary diasporas, for example, when do these communities stop being diasporas from somewhere else? When do they become local? And is this a sort of question that makes sense?
No, that's a good,
thank you.
That actually is a good question, and it makes a lot of sense, because that's actually how, I keep saying the traditional definition of diaspora, but some of the early, I mean, and when I say early, it's not like I'm talking about the 19th century thing. I mean, some of the definitions of diaspora are sort of in the 60s. One of the questions that was always raised in that literature is, well, when does a group stop being a diaspora? And pretty much the sort of consensus was that when they sort of get integrated into the mainstream of that society, then they're probably not, you don't think of them as a diaspora anymore. I should say that my sort of thinking about diaspora looks at this sort of traditional definition of having at least 5 criteria, or not necessarily all of them, but some of them, that it's a forced migration, that it's the community experiences some sort of alienation in the receiving nation. That there's this either mythical or effort to connect with the homeland. So that's a third criteria. That they're often in touch with other communities of the diaspora. So like things like Pan-Africanism, those movements, that would be an example of that. And then I can't think of what the fifth one is, but I've been criticized for saying, oh yeah, that's the way we used to think of diasporas, but that's not how we think of them today, that those definitions or those criteria don't apply. And so a lot of things that people would call a diaspora, to me, a diaspora is it's not any kind of migration, it's a particular kind of migration. And so those four criteria I gave you are examples of what I see those criteria, how they define a diaspora. But to answer your question, and the diaspora ends when, that group is no longer, Seminar will probably not be a diaspora. And, historically they would be a diaspora, but once the descendants become part of the mainstream, then you wouldn't see them as maybe a diaspora community anymore. Or maybe even the Creole people of Sierra Leone. So that's how I see it, but some people would see it differently. That's the problem with diaspora, is that there are all these different ideas and approaches to what is a diaspora, like so many terms in the social sciences.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was great. I keep the questions coming too. I know I did want to, I forgot, Mary Hill-Harris had a point about the structures, the architecture. Is that correct, Mary? Did you want to share those thoughts?
Yes, it's just that I have seen buildings very like that, except not with the top floor in Barbados. And I think they probably, as you said, are common in the Caribbean. And very good to see you again, Theresa. I hadn't realized you were here.
Yeah.
This information was all totally new to me, so it was really fascinating. And one remark about the breadfruit. Our first field season in Barbados, we were trying to eat very cheaply, and there was not that much that we could afford in the supermarkets, but we managed to get some breadfruit. We mixed it with tinned corned beef, which I personally don't like very much, but it made a very nourishing meal for hungry field workers.
Yeah, I actually haven't had breadfruit. And the one time I did, but one time I had the opportunity, it was in St. Croix.
Yeah.
And I guess it wasn't really it was sort of I guess an in-service teacher workshop on slavery. And one of the natives or residents of St. Croix, she was just outraged that they served breadfruit, because she said, oh, that's the food of slavery. How dare you? And she just went on this rant. And so I was so intimidated for eating it, because I figured, if I ate it, she'd probably say something about, would be critical about it. But but I know there are different attitudes toward breadfruit throughout the Caribbean. Some islands seem to embrace it and others don't.
Well, we couldn't find it in the supermarket because everybody had a tree in their garden. So you sort of had to wait until you found somebody who would give you one.
Oh, I see.
But it's not all that special, but it's a change for mashed potato.
Right.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, I had my own question about the vats and the use, the other sort of material culture that comes into play with food, and how what you found in the different case studies about because the idea of keeping the vats for the cane sugar alcoholic drink in the home, what you've seen as far as, or what you're finding interesting about some of the other case studies, and that type of culinary material component. Any sort of comments on that, Theresa?
Yeah, I guess one thing I didn't mention that was in the paper about like in seminar, their foodways there is sort of a combination of Dominican foodways and what I would say is more West Indian or Anglophone Caribbean, because the New Year's dinner we had sancocho, which is Caribbean. I mean, Spanish Antillean. It's a stew with root crops, yuca, yuca, sweet potato, plantain, and then meat. And then we had rice and peas, but rice and peas fixed like Jamaican style with coconut and using coconut water to make the rice and peas. And my Dominican companion, he was just outraged that they would put coconut, with the rice cook it with the rice and peas. He just, he ate it, but you could tell he wasn't happy about it. But yes, food waste definitely is a certain important aspect of these various diasporas. And one of the things, like the historical, this doesn't come out in archaeology, but the Black Loyalists apparently wanted, had imported food come in, and because they didn't want to eat the local African food. So that was a conflict, with these reverse diasporas, is that and also with the Barbadian example, was that the new migrants didn't want to necessarily eat local African food, even though in some ways you think, well, gosh, it's pretty similar. At least that's my thinking of it. But they wanted to stick to the crops they were used to from wherever they came. So that sort of was a sticking point with or I shouldn't, a characteristic of each case study, where the food was different. And they wanted to stick to their food ways and not necessarily, at least not initially, adopt the local food.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Just another question we have from the audience. To what extent do people who are part of a reverse or secondary diaspora identify themselves as being part of that type of diaspora? And I guess along with that line, how do you show that? How would you find that in the evidence you look at? Sorry to add that on to the end, but.
You mean, how would I see it in archaeologically? Yeah,
but the first part of that question is people who are a part of a reverse or secondary diaspora identify themselves as being part of that type of diaspora. So how do they find themselves within, how do they look?
Right, yeah, they may not actually use that term. Those are like social, concepts we use as social scientists. I don't know that people would necessarily identify themselves as that. they would identify, like in Seminar, the people there have traditionally identified themselves as American, even though they're generations beyond the Americans that first settled there. They just identify themselves as being different, different because of their ancestral roots. I mean, it's just like in, like in the I mean, I'm always surprised where some Europeans who've lived in Africa for generations describe themselves as African, I mean, African, but of European descent. So it's the same sort of thing where people identify their origins. I mean, part of their identity is their original migration of their ancestors. So so that's how I see them identifying themselves, not necessarily saying, oh, I'm from a third wave migration or I'm from a reverse diaspora. Well, now, what was the second?
Oh, and so I guess feeding into that, your interpretation of those buttons that you find in Nova Scotia, or the material, the material that would sort of indicate or inform your reading of that sense of being part of a diasporic generation, whichever, whether it's reverse or that secondary or initial for an initial form.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite, you mean how as a researcher I'm going to interpret it? Well, here again, I was for the Black Loyalists, I was pretty much interpreting what the people who did that work, how they interpreted those artifacts. They were saying that this is a middle class Black Loyalist, because they, from historical records, they knew that the head of household, he'd been an officer in the Black militia, and they also knew that about his wife having come from a free Black family, and they were apparently in New York and was wealthy. What I didn't get into is the rest of the story, which is she left him after he apparently had a child with a woman that was like their servant or something like that. And then so she went back to New York, and then he just sort of disappeared. What they've done is a very good job at Birchtown and linking individuals to that site through historical research. For example, there was an enslaved man from a well-known plantation outside of Charleston, Mulberry Plantation, which is a rice plantation outside of Charleston, and he apparently was a Black Loyalist who then goes to Nova Scotia. But what happens to him once he gets to know? I mean, well, so they knew he got as far as Nova Scotia, but then what happened after that, it's not clear. But they and it's all on their website. I mean, where you could just look and see these different individuals and see where their their trajectory once they migrate to Canada.
Yeah, it's really interesting to have each of these case studies. I mean, the way you're sort of folding these all together, I think, is going to make a really interesting contribution in this upcoming volume. I think it's really exciting. I'm really excited to get my hands on it when it's done. And so let's go ahead and see other questions from the audience. Anyone, go ahead and you can raise your hand. Oh, great. Is it Jan Hedich?
Yes, Jan. Yes. This is interesting because this is new to me, and I have never thought deeply before about the definition of a diaspora. So if you take, for instance, Sierra Leone and Liberia, did these settlers choose to go themselves, or were they sent? And were the local people regarding them as unwelcome incoming colonists?
Yeah, with the only for both Sierra Leone and Liberia, most of those settlers were, decided to go. So it was a voluntary situation. And I'm trying to think who, well, I guess the resettled, the enslaved people that were rescued by the British Navy in Sierra Leone, I guess they didn't have a choice. I mean, well, their choice was to stay off. I mean, yeah, they didn't have a choice. So for them, it wasn't a choice.
Yes.
But it probably was a better choice than having, being enslaved in the Americas. But for the Black Loyalists, it was either stay in Nova Scotia or go to Sierra Leone. And that's why, and many of them thought that Sierra Leone would be a better prospect. Certainly wouldn't be as cold.
No, I was thinking that.
and I think they were optimistic about the possibility that they would have good relations with the indigenous Africans, but that didn't happen, at least not initially. The Maroons who they brought to Sierra Leone, one source I read said they requested to go to Sierra Leone as opposed to Nova Scotia. I guess they gave them the choice, and they said we'd rather go to Sierra Leone. So there was some choice involved. But I mean, I think with a lot of, with all those different groups, I mean, their choices were really sort of limited. I mean, you either stay in a bad situation or you take a risk to see maybe to have a chance at a better situation. And, like for the Americans who went to Hispaniola, it turned out to not be that, and from my looking at it, not to be that great of a situation. It's interesting though that some of the interviews that Frederick Douglas did of the seminar people, they said that, he was asking them, well, what were their feelings about if the US annexed the Dominican Republic? And they were thinking, well, they said, well, we wouldn't mind going back to the United States now that the United States is no longer a slaveholding territory. But see, during President Polk's time, which was in the 1840s, he looked into annexing the Dominican Republic. And at that time, they wouldn't have wanted to go because it was still a slaveholding territory. So I don't know, I guess I went beyond answering your question, but it's just in the situations.
Yes, and I suppose that, many of the resettled people would have no idea which part of Africa their ancestors came from anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So they may have had no picture at all of how vast Africa is. And so I suppose they might have hoped to find that they were going home.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them thought it would be again a better situation than in the United States.
Yes. Yes.
And, you know, in some cases, I think that's what they found. In others, they didn't.
Yes. Would convicts being settled in Australia, would that be defined as a diaspora?
That's a good question. Well, certainly it was a forced settlement. I mean, I guess you could. I mean, you know, one time the diaspora only, you know, initially the term only referred to what the Jewish diaspora. You know, that's was the tradition, and then it began to be applied to other groups. Well, I went to a conference and they spent 2 days arguing about who was the first, or when did it became associated with Africans, the African diaspora. And I think the consensus was that in a conference that was in Tanzania in the 60s, that's when was the official use of diaspora to refer to Africans. But I mean, but up until that time, it really wasn't applied to other groups. And, you know, more recently, you see the Chinese diaspora, references to the Chinese being a diaspora to at least to North America, you know, in the 19th century. I don't know. I mean, some people, like I said, sometimes the words almost used synonymously with migration.
Yes,
but
that's what
I still feel like it's a type of migration, and
yes.
it's
no, I hadn't realized that.
Not every migration is a diaspora.
Yes,
but
it's very interesting. Thank you. I found this you know, a fascinating subject. I've been very interested. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, I'm happy that you've enjoyed the talk. We're coming up to the end here. We have time for maybe one more question. If someone has a quick question for Professor Singleton. Or any other sort of comments? Liz, did you have any other comments as we sort of wrap up this first seminar? Oh.
Just a quick one. I was just curious about the quality of, you talked a lot about the archaeology and the material culture, but I was wondering about how well documented some of these journeys were. Like, what kind of historical records are there, and are there lots of gaps in the record keeping? It just struck me that this could be a really interesting puzzle, but also very hard to research on the historical side.
Yeah, they've been primarily researched on the historical side at this point. People are just beginning to think about looking at them, you know, archaeologically. The documentation varies. For example, for the Barbadian example, that the book that Blanton just, or not just, but it's only, I think it was published in 2019. She was able to find a lot of documentation, various kinds of, I guess, records that were kept by families, and that sort of thing. And you know, like the date of the actual departure and arrival, you know, all those are well documented. But others, though, it's not, you know, it's not as well documented. The Black Loyalists seem to be, you know, fairly well documented, particularly going to Nova Scotia when they came to Sierra Leone. Well, see, I would think those records are the Sierra Leone company. You know, when you had these companies, you look at their papers, and So that could be well documented. There have been several books on the migration from Philadelphia to Hispaniola. There's a variety of different kinds of records, but I guess where archaeology would be useful is just trying to, well, first of all, find these sites on the ground. That's not always that easy.
Absolutely.
And when you do find them, will you be able to excavate them? I think Kristen Fellows, I think she wanted to do excavations, but I think between the community and just trying to do work in the archaeological work as an expatriate in the Dominican Republic, she found that she was probably unable to do anything other than sort of surveying kinds of things and looking at above ground archaeological resources. But yeah, the documents, on these different diasporas vary, but it seems like there seem to be enough of them for people to write books actually, I guess, on all four that I talked about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, for the record, I think this is a fantastic opening seminar, and I just want to take a moment to have everyone thank Professor Singleton one last time for her talk, phenomenal talk, really wonderful research, and yeah, thank you so much for coming today. And,
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful. All right, everyone, and please go